The record before you, gentlemen of the Casa de Contratación, bears the seal of this office and the date of the 15th of March, 1526. I am told it will be read into the formal register of maritime inquiry, and that my words, once given, become property of the Crown. I understand this. I ask only that you record also what I place before you now on this table. A crossbow bolt, my own, recovered floating in the pilot's gig on the morning of the 22nd of October last year, in the open Atlantic, well clear of any island or reef. You will observe that it is bent back upon itself at the midsection, not broken, not snapped. Bent, as one bends a green branch, except that this is iron-tipped hardwood, and the angle of deflection is not one that any impact with stone or hull timber or anything I have encountered in 23 years of navigation produces. I fired that bolt the previous night at a shape standing in the shallows. The shape did not fall. The bolt was returned to me in the condition you see. I have brought it here not to ask you to explain it, because I cannot explain it myself, but to establish at the outset that I am not the kind of man who invents. I am a navigator. I record what I observe. What I observed on that island in the autumn of 1525 is what I will now describe to you in the order it occurred, without embellishment, and with as much precision as my memory and the gravity of this occasion permit. My name is Iker Echeverria, born in Lequeitio, on the Basque coast, in the year 1481, which makes me 44 years of age at the time of these events. I have been at sea since I was 14. I hold a license from this very office, granted in 1511, for the piloting of vessels in Atlantic waters, and I have navigated in service to the Crown on 4 prior expeditions, including the resupply of the Canary garrison in 1518, and 2 crossings to the Caribbean, under commanders whose names this office knows. I am telling you this not out of vanity, but because I want you to understand that I am not a superstitious man. I do not see monsters in fog. I do not mistake whale spouts for sea serpents. I have been in storms that broke 2 masts, and I did not conclude that God was angry with me personally. I am a practical man, trained in mathematics and celestial observation, and when I tell you what happened on the island to which Captain Hernando de Salcedo led us in the autumn of 1525, I am telling you only what I saw and heard, and measured to the best of my ability, under conditions that I will describe accurately. The expedition departed the port of La Palma on the 7th of September, 1525. We were 3 caravels, the Santa Magdalena, which was the flagship under Captain Salcedo, the San Esteban, a smaller vessel carrying supplies, and the Nuestra Señora de los Vientos, which was mine to pilot. Our complement was 41 men in total, sailors, soldiers, a carpenter, a priest, and the captain's personal aide. Our orders, issued by the Consejo de Indias under the authority of the Casa de Contratación, were to locate and survey an island chain described in the dying deposition of a Portuguese navigator named Silveira, who had encountered the chain some years before and had described it as a viable way station on the mid-Atlantic route, sheltered, fresh-watered, and suitable as an emergency resupply point for outbound fleets. Silveira had been dying of fever when he gave his account, and his coordinates were imprecise, but Captain Salcedo had been given latitude estimates and a bearing, and he believed we could find the island within a range of approximately 3 days, sailing from our projected course. I believed the same. The mathematics supported it. We were not sailing blind. I should tell you something about Captain Salcedo, because his decisions matter to what follows, and because he deserves an honest accounting in this record. He was a man of about 50, gray-haired, lean, with the kind of stillness that comes from long command. He was not a navigator himself, but he understood ships, and he understood men, and he had a quality that I have seen in only a few commanders. He did not pretend to know things he did not know. When I disagreed with him on a matter of navigation, he listened. When I was wrong, he said so without cruelty. When he was wrong, he said so without embarrassment. I respected him. I want that to be in the record. What happened between us on the evening of the 21st of October was not a failure of respect. It was a disagreement between two men who had reached the limit of what experience could tell them, and one of us was right, and one of us was wrong, and I have lived with that knowledge every day since. The crossing was without significant incident. We encountered heavy weather west of the Canaries that cost us 2 days of progress and damaged the San Esteban's foremast, but our carpenter, Tomas Bravo, had it repaired adequately within a day, and we continued on the bearing. Father Alonso held Mass each morning on the Santa Magdalena's deck, and the men were in good spirits. A soldier named Rodrigo Mena, young, perhaps 20 years old, kept the crew amused with a talent for mimicking the calls of birds, which sounds trivial, but matters later, because it means I can identify his voice in darkness. We sighted the island on the morning of the 14th of October, 1525, from a distance of approximately 8 leagues, and it appeared exactly as Silvera's account had described. A volcanic cone rising from the Atlantic, dark and steep, trailing a lower ridge to the east, with green visible on the upper slopes, and what appeared to be a stream running down the south face. Captain Salcedo ordered us to approach under careful sail, and we came to anchor in a natural bay on the western side of the island by midday. I want to tell you what the island looked like when we arrived, because the contrast with what it became matters. The bay was calm. The water was clear enough that I could see the sand bottom at 6 fathoms. The beach was black volcanic sand, clean, unmarked. The interior rose quickly from the beach into dense forest, and above the forest, the ridge was bare rock, and above that, the old crater was open to the sky. There were birds, numerous birds, the kind that suggest fresh water, and insects, and an undisturbed interior. There were no signs of human habitation visible from the ship, no smoke, no constructed landing, no boats. Father Alonso stood at the rail and said it was as clean as the first day of creation. I wrote in my log that it appeared uninhabited and suitable for survey. I have that log here if you wish to see it. I wrote those words in good faith. We sent a shore party of 8 men that first afternoon. 2 soldiers, 2 sailors, Tomas Bravo the carpenter, Father Alonso, and 2 more men whose names I will give you if required. I remained on the Nuestra Señora de los Vientos to take celestial observations while the light held. The shore party returned before dark with good news. Fresh water running clear from a stream about 200 yards into the interior, no large predators observed, soil that appeared suitable for agriculture, and timber of a quality that Bravo assessed as excellent for ship repair. The soldiers reported no signs of habitation. We planned a full landing the next morning. I should note here, for the record, something that I did not assign significance to at the time, but which I have thought about many times since. When the shore party returned that evening, Father Alonso was quiet. He ate his supper, he answered questions, but he had the look of a man who has heard something he is still processing. I asked him directly if something had troubled him ashore, and he said no, nothing specific, only that the forest had been very quiet. I took this as the observation of a man unused to dense woodland, which can feel oppressive to those without experience of it. I did not press him. I should have pressed him. I am recording this now because the record should be complete. The second day, the 15th of October, we landed the full party. All 41 men came ashore in 3 waves, using the ship's boats and the pilot's gig, and we established a base camp on the beach above the tide line, using canvas from the supply stores to make a covered area for the equipment and provisions we would need for a survey lasting several days. Captain Salcedo organized the men efficiently into 3 parties, one to survey the southern coastline, one to begin charting the interior terrain, and one to remain at camp as a maintenance and guard detail. I was to coordinate navigation observations from the camp. Rodrigo Mena was assigned to the interior survey party under Salcedo himself. It was during the morning of the 15th, not long after we had established camp, that the carpenter Tomas Bravo found the first fire ring. He found it approximately 300 yards north along the beach from our camp, in a shallow depression in the sand, where the tree line came close to the water. He came back to camp and reported it to me as an interesting curiosity. A ring of stones, large stones, arranged in a deliberate circle. I walked out with him to look at it. When I saw the size of the ring, I stood still for a moment and looked at it without speaking. The ring was, by my estimate, approximately 12 feet in diameter. Not 12 feet across the outer edge, but 12 feet across the interior, clear space. The stones forming the ring were each roughly the size and weight of a large millstone, and they had been brought to that location deliberately, because the beach sand around them showed no other stones of comparable size. Inside the ring, there was a residue of old ash, long cold and partially washed away by rain, but enough to confirm that fires had been built there. And inside the ring, arranged in a pattern along the inner edge, were bones, large animal bones, or what I initially took to be large animal bones, because the scale of them was my first reference. They had been sorted. That was the word Bravo used, and it was the right word, sorted. Not scattered, not heaped, but arranged by type, femur with femur, rib with rib, the way a butcher might arrange cuts. Each arrangement was neat. Some of the bones had been cracked at the marrow ends, which is something humans do. No known animal does it in that pattern. I do not want to speculate about what I did not directly observe. What I observed was this: a ring of stones too large for one man to lift, arranged in a perfect circle 12 feet across, around the remains of many fires built over what appeared to be a considerable period of time, with bones sorted and stacked in a manner that required deliberate intent. I reported this to Captain Salcedo when his party returned for the midday meal. He listened carefully, examined the ring himself, and told the men that it was evidence of prior habitation, possibly indigenous peoples who had since departed, or possibly the camp of some earlier navigator we did not know of. He was calm about it. He told the men to stay alert, to work in pairs, and to report anything else they found. This was the correct response. I would have said the same. What I did not say, and what Salcedo did not say, was that no prior navigator had been reported anywhere near this location, and that the bones were fresh enough that they had not fully bleached, which means whoever made those rings had used this beach within the last year, or possibly less. I did not say it because I could not be certain of my estimate of the bone's age, and I did not wish to create alarm based on an uncertain inference. I am recording it now. The bones were not old. They were the bones of something recently eaten. There is something else I should record here, which I discovered that same afternoon, and which I planted in my log without fully understanding its significance. I walked up the beach further, beyond the first ring, and found two more. Each was the same diameter, the same deliberate stone arrangement, the same sorted bone deposits, but the second ring was higher on the beach, further from the water's edge, and the stones forming it were even larger than those of the first. The third ring was further still. I could not move the stones of the third ring individually. A strong man might have managed one with effort and time. To have moved them all and placed them in a precise circle would have required, at minimum, a dozen strong men working with levers, or fewer men of a size I could not then calculate, and did not wish to calculate. I also found something at the high ridge that day, or rather, I found evidence of something there, and I wrote in my log only that the survey of the ridge would require additional time, and that what I had seen demanded a more careful examination than I could make before dark. I will tell you what that was in the proper sequence of events. I mention it now only because I want you to understand that by the end of the second day, I was holding two things in my mind at once: the official reassurance I had given the men and the captain, and the private accounting I was conducting in my own mind, which was reaching conclusions I was not yet willing to speak aloud. Father Alonso spoke aloud what I would not that evening. He had been with the Southern Coast Party, and he had found more fire rings along that coastline, at least 5 more, and he had studied the bone arrangements with the attention of a man who has read widely and who does not dismiss what he observes. He requested to speak to Captain Salcedo and myself together, privately, after the evening meal. We sat away from the men, and Father Alonso said the fire rings were not cooking fires. He said the arrangement of the bones was consistent with what he had read, in the accounts of early travelers to strange regions, of ritual display. the deliberate presentation of the remains of consumed animals as a kind of record or claim, a marking of territory. He said, speaking carefully, "The scale of the stones and the volume of the bone deposits suggest something was eating here regularly, in quantity, over a long period, and was large enough to drag those stones into position without assistance." He paused after saying this. Then he said, "I think we should not sleep ashore tonight." Captain Salcedo considered this for a long moment. Then he said that pulling 41 men back to the ships before a full survey was completed was not justified by fire rings and old bones, but that he would increase the shore watch and ensure that all men were armed. He told Father Alonso that his observation was valued and would be taken seriously, but that he would not allow the anxiety of one night to compromise a mission that the Crown had ordered. Father Alonso accepted this without further argument. He looked at me once when Salcedo finished speaking, and what passed between us in that look was not alarm exactly, but a kind of mutual recognition that we were both recording something, and that the record was already more serious than the captain had acknowledged. The second thing I want to open here, for you to hold until later in my account, is this. There came a moment the following day when Tomas Bravo, who had been the most vocal skeptic among us, who had said at the midday meal on the 15th that the fire rings were almost certainly the camps of Berber fishermen driven off course, who had said the bones were from turtles and sea lions and nothing unusual, changed his position entirely and without explanation in the early hours of the 17th. He said nothing dramatic. He simply stopped arguing and began assisting me in preparing the pilot's gig for rapid deployment. I will tell you what he saw that changed his mind. But I need to tell it in sequence, because the sequence is part of what I am presenting to you, gentlemen. The sequence is the argument. The 15th of October passed without incident, beyond what I have described. The men slept on the beach, in the camp, because there were too many of us to comfortably berth aboard the ship simultaneously, and because the night was warm and the sky was clear. I slept lightly. The night was quiet in the way that the night on an island without large predators should be quiet. Insects, the sound of the sea, occasional movement of birds, nothing else. I rose before dawn and took latitude observations, and the island was simply an island, dark and large and still. On the 16th, the interior survey party that had gone furthest into the forest reported something that Salcedo relayed to me that afternoon. They had found, approximately 1 mile into the interior, a section of forest where the undergrowth had been compressed along a path. Not a cut path, not a cleared path, but a compressed path, as if something very heavy had moved through it repeatedly over time, bending and flattening the vegetation, rather than cutting it. The path was, by the estimate of the soldier who measured it by lying across it, approximately 8 feet wide. A party of men walking in single file does not make an 8-foot-wide compressed path. A party of men walking abreast might make such a path, but they would need to number perhaps 5 or 6 across, and 41 men walking in formation for a mile do not create the impression that this path gave, which was a long-established route, something that had been used over many seasons. The soil in the compressed path was, in several places, depressed into oval shapes that might have been footprints, except that each oval depression was roughly 3 feet in its longest dimension. I have stated that I am not a man who invents. I am also not a man who jumps to the largest conclusion available when smaller ones remain possible. I told the men that the depressions might have been formed by water pooling after rainfall. I told them the path might have been created by a herd of some large animal we had not yet observed. I told them these things because they were possible, and because the men needed a framework that allowed them to continue working, and because I genuinely did not know. I am telling you now that I did not believe my own reassurances. I believed the depressions were footprints. I believed the path was a route used by something of considerable size. I did not say this. I should perhaps have said it. But I was not the commander, and the commander had decided we would continue the survey. That evening, the evening of the 16th of October, I walked up to the high ridge above the camp. I had mentioned this in my log 2 days prior, and I want to account for what I found there. I went alone, which was against Salcedo's order to work in pairs, and I went at a time when the light was still adequate, but the men were occupied with their evening tasks. I climbed the eastern slope of the ridge along what appeared to be a natural path in the rock, and I reached the ridgeline perhaps 2 hours before sunset, and I looked down at both sides, the bay side where our 3 ships were anchored, and the eastern face of the island dropping away to the sea. And on the eastern face, below the ridge on a wide flat shelf of rock, there were marks, worn marks, the marks of stone laid on stone, and moved and laid again, over what must have been a very long period, because the impressions in the softer rock of the shelf were deep. They were percussion marks, the marks of flat stones being struck rhythmically against a flat surface, worn into the shelf rock, the way the step of a staircase wears down over centuries of use. I counted the worn patches. There were 11 of them, spaced along the shelf at intervals, and each patch was roughly 2 feet in diameter, and the wear in each patch suggested that the same motion had been performed there again and again over a span of time I could not calculate. I understood, looking at those marks, what I was seeing. I did not want to understand it, so I spent some time looking at the horizon and making notes in my log that were more neutral in their language than what I was actually thinking. I noted the percussion marks and their dimensions. I noted the 11 positions. I noted the view from the ridge of the bay below. And I noted, and I want you to mark this in the record, that from the ridge, anyone standing there could see all 3 of our ships at anchor and could count the men moving on the beach and the ship decks below. Whatever had used that ridge had used it to watch the bay, and it had been doing this for a very long time. I did not tell Captain Salcedo what I had found on the ridge that evening. I returned to camp before full dark, and I sat with my log, and I wrote my private observations, and then I wrote a second version, the official survey log, and the 2 versions were not the same. I want this to be in the record. I knew by the evening of the 16th that we were being observed. I did not say so. I told myself that I was being responsible by not creating alarm based on circumstantial evidence. But I think the truth is that I was also afraid, not of the island, but of saying what I believed out loud in front of 40 men, because once you say a thing, it becomes real in a way that keeping it private does not. I am sorry for that. It is in the record now. The night of the 16th passed in silence, but it was a different silence than the night before. I do not know how to quantify the difference. The insects were the same, the sea was the same, but I lay awake for most of it, and the men around me seemed to sleep with less ease than the previous night, though I cannot say whether that was their genuine response to something or whether I was reading my own state into their faces. Morning came. I took my observations. I made my log entry. I said nothing. It was the 3rd night, the night of the 17th, that the percussion began. I had been asleep, or very nearly asleep, when it started. A single strike, flat stone on flat stone, from the direction of the eastern ridge, perhaps half a mile distant. 1 beat, clean, deliberate, and then silence, the length of perhaps 3 full breaths, and then an answer. The same sound, unmistakably the same material and action, from the south, further away but clear in the still night air. And then a third, from the west, from somewhere in the interior forest below the ridge on that side. And then silence again, longer this time, perhaps 10 breaths, and in that silence the men around me began to wake, one by one, because the sound had been large enough to carry through sleep, but small enough that waking was gradual. Then the 4th beat, from the north, from somewhere near the water's edge beyond the camp perimeter, much closer than the others, and the men were all awake then. There was no panic, not yet, because the sound itself was not violent, it was simply sound, but the configuration of it was immediately clear to everyone. 4 distinct points, each answered in sequence, and together they enclosed us. I counted 8 breaths of silence after the 4th beat. Then all 4 points sounded together, not quite simultaneously but within the span of a single heartbeat, and then immediately 4 more voices added, from directions between the original 4, and the sound ceased again. I stood up. I could see Salcedo already on his feet near the camp's central fire, which had burned low, and Father Alonso standing behind him with his beads in his hands, not praying, just holding them. Tomas Bravo sat upright in his blanket and had not moved. Rodrigo Mena, the young soldier, had his crossbow in his hands and was looking east, toward the ridge, which was the direction of the first beat. Nobody spoke. We were all listening. The percussion began again. This time it did not stop. Beat, answer, addition, enclosure, and then continuous. The original points sounding in a steady rhythm, with the added voices filling in between them. And the combined effect was not a cacophony, but a pattern, a deliberate pattern that I recognized with the part of my mind that understands rhythm and mathematics as something organized. Not random, not frenzied, measured. Each beat the same interval from the last. Each addition placed so that the gaps between voices were closed in sequence, from east around to north. It was, and I choose this word carefully, methodical. Someone, or something, was performing a coordinated action across a perimeter approximately half a mile across, in the dark, using multiple participants in multiple positions, and the coordination was exact. The men were quiet. I want to say that for the record. In the first minutes of the percussion, with perhaps a dozen distinct percussive points active and the sound encircling us completely, the 40 men on that beach did not cry out or run. They sat or stood, and they listened. Some of them looked to me because I was the pilot, and pilots are associated with knowing where one is and what one should do, and I looked back at them and I said, as calmly as I could manage, that we should maintain our positions, tend the fire, and wait for the sound to stop. I said I believed it was a territorial demonstration, the way some animals beat on hollow logs or strike trees, and that the appropriate response was to show no alarm. I said this in a level voice. I did not entirely believe it myself. Captain Salcedo ordered the shore watch doubled, and gave instructions that no man was to leave the camp perimeter under any circumstances until first light. He moved between the men quietly, and spoke to each of them briefly, and the effect of this was to keep the camp ordered when it might have become otherwise. I have said that I respected him, and I want to add here, watching him work the camp that night in the sound of the percussion, speaking quietly to frightened men and keeping them in their positions without threat or bluster, I thought he was one of the finest commanders I had served under. I am saying this before I tell you about our argument, because I want the record to reflect that the argument was between two good faith positions held by men who both had reasons for their views. The percussion continued for approximately 3 hours. I timed it by the stars. It did not accelerate. It did not stop and restart. It simply sounded, continuously, from every direction, for 3 hours, and then it ceased. Not gradually. It ceased all at once, every voice simultaneously, as if an order had been given that I could not hear. The silence after was more startling than the sound. Several men exhaled audibly. Rodrigo Mena put his crossbow down, and his hands, I noticed, were shaking. Father Alonso crossed himself. Tomas Bravo looked at me and said, quietly, that he wanted a word with me in the morning. Nothing entered the camp that night. Nothing was disturbed. The fire rings and shore parties had all returned before sunset, and there was no one in the interior. We were intact, all 41 of us, and when the sun rose the next morning, the island looked exactly as it had the morning before. Birds, clear water, black sand, the 3 ships rocking gently in the bay. If I had been a different kind of man, or if the morning had brought no evidence, I might have found a rational explanation, and perhaps the men might have gradually convinced themselves that what they heard was some natural phenomenon. Wind through rock formations, I have heard, can produce sounds of a percussive nature. Certain sea caves produce rhythmic impact sounds from wave action. I might have said this. But Tomas Bravo came to me before the men had finished their morning meal and showed me what he had found at the camp perimeter, and I could not say it. 3 of the canvas panels we had stretched between poles to form the supply shelter had been moved. Not torn, not knocked over, but removed from their lashings. with the lashings intact and placed precisely flat on the ground 10 feet from where they had been hung. 2 of the supply bags, heavy canvas sacks of ship biscuit each weighing approximately 30 pounds, had been relocated from inside the shelter to outside it, side by side, centered exactly between 2 shelter poles. The water jars, 4 ceramic jars, each holding perhaps 8 gallons, had been moved from their positions along the shelter wall and arranged in a row facing the interior of the island, rather than the sea. Each jar was upright. None were broken. Tomas Bravo looked at me when I had examined these arrangements, and he said, "Something was in the camp last night, and it was looking at our provisions." I agreed. He said, "It was looking at them very carefully." I agreed with this also. He asked me how large something would need to be to move one of those water jars without waking the men sleeping 10 feet away, and I told him that the jar itself was not especially heavy, perhaps 50 pounds full, and that a person of average build moving quietly might manage it without waking the camp. He looked at me steadily while I said this, and when I finished he said, "Echeverria, the lashings are intact and the panels are flat. Whoever moved the canvas panels removed each lashing knot cleanly and then laid the panel down without a sound, in the dark, 10 feet from sleeping men." He paused. "I want to leave today." I told him that the decision was the captain's. He said he knew that. He said he was telling me, as pilot, his assessment of the situation, because it was my job to take advice from the ship's carpenter on the seaworthiness of circumstances. I told him I had heard him. He went back to his work, and I went to find Captain Salcedo and told him everything: the camp disturbances, Bravo's assessment, my own from the evening before on the ridge, Father Alonso's warning on the first night, all of it, in sequence, as I should have told it 2 days earlier. Salcedo listened to the entire account without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, looking at the water. Then he told me that he had 4 men in the interior, a surveying party he had sent before dawn that morning, before the camp disturbances were discovered. They had been ordered to chart the high forest and were not expected back until the following evening. He said he would not leave without them. He said it simply, without drama, as a statement of fact. I said that we did not know what had been in the camp, and that waiting a full day and another night with that uncertainty was a risk to the remaining men. He said that abandoning 4 men in an unknown interior was not a risk he was willing to calculate. He said it was not a calculation. I said that it was mathematically a question of 36 remaining lives against 4 who might already be beyond our reach. He looked at me when I said this, and his expression did not change, but he said, "Not yet." 2 words. He meant, not yet beyond our reach. He meant, until we know otherwise, we act as if they are alive and reachable. I accepted this, because it was his authority, and because the argument was not over yet, and I knew it would come again. That day, the 18th, passed in a state that I can only describe as suspended. The men were not in panic, but they were not at ease. Salcedo organized a rotation of armed watches at the camp perimeter, 4 men at all times, and he moved through the camp with a calm that I believe was partly genuine and partly performed for the men's benefit. Father Alonso walked the perimeter in the morning and evening, which the men found comforting. Tomas Bravo did not argue further, but he spent the afternoon making the pilot's gig ready for immediate launch, checking the oars, the rigging, the water supply. I watched him do this and said nothing. He was doing what I would have told him to do if I had the authority to order it. I kept my observations, and I did something I had not done before on this expedition. I timed the intervals between the bird sounds, because birds in undisturbed woodland have a rhythm of call and response that is reasonably consistent, and I had been noticing since the previous day that the birds in the interior forest were not maintaining their usual intervals. They would fall silent all at once for periods of several minutes, and then resume, and then fall silent again. I timed these silences. They were not random. They occurred at intervals of approximately 40 minutes throughout the morning, lengthening to approximately 20 minutes through the afternoon, and by evening they were occurring every 10 minutes or so. Something in the forest was disturbing the birds. Whatever it was coming closer. I noted this in my private log and said nothing to the men. The percussion began again that night at exactly the point of full dark. Not gradually, but immediately, as if the darkness were a signal. And it was different from the previous night in a way that I want to be precise about, because the difference is important. The previous night, the sound had begun at a single point and multiplied over several minutes, building from one voice to many. On the night of the 18th, there was no building. The moment darkness was complete, the percussion was already surrounding us. Multiple voices, from every direction, at full intensity, as if they had taken their positions in daylight and simply waited for the darkness to begin. The implication of this, which I understood, and which I believe Father Alonso understood, from the way he closed his eyes briefly and pressed his lips together, was that they had been in their positions since before dark. They had been positioned around us while we could still see, and we had not seen them. The sound was closer on this night. The voice from the north, nearest the water's edge, was perhaps 100 yards from the camp perimeter, rather than the half-mile of the previous night. I could hear the impact of stone on stone clearly enough to gauge the size of the stones by the pitch of the sound, and what I heard suggested stones not of the 3 to 5 pound range a man carries comfortably, but something heavier, larger, with the deep impact resonance that comes from mass. We were not listening to men with rocks. I am not certain what we were listening to, and I want to be careful in this record, not to state as fact what I can only infer. But I heard what I heard, and I am telling you the size of it. This night the percussion did not last 3 hours. It lasted the entire night. Every hour I took a star sighting and noted the time, and the sound continued through all of them, steady, unbroken, from every direction, through until first light. No one in the camp slept. We built the fire as large as we could, and we sat around it, and we listened. And around midnight, Rodrigo Mena, who had his crossbow and had been staring into the dark north, toward the water, said that he could see something. I went to where he was standing at the camp's northern perimeter, and I looked in the direction he was indicating. The water was approximately 50 yards from us, dark, with the silhouette of the Santa Magdalena visible against the stars beyond. And between us and the water, at the edge of the firelight's reach, there was a shape. I want to be careful here. I did not see it clearly. What I can describe is a vertical mass, darker than the darkness around it, standing still, at a distance where the firelight was insufficient to illuminate it with any resolution. What I can tell you about its size is this. I am 5 feet and 7 inches in height, and I am an experienced estimator of distance and dimension, and the thing standing at the edge of the light was taller than the distance between my feet and the top of my head, by a margin that I cannot state with certainty, but which I will describe as considerable. It was not a man standing close to the camp and appearing tall because of the darkness. It was at the correct distance for the perspective, and it was very large. It did not move while I watched it. I watched it for perhaps 5 minutes. Then it was not there. I did not see it leave. I looked away for a moment to check that Rodrigo Mena was still beside me and had not fired his crossbow, and when I looked back, the shape was gone. The percussion from the north continued. What had been standing there had simply ceased to be visible. I went to Salcedo and told him what I had seen. He came to the northern perimeter and looked, and there was nothing there. And he looked at me and I looked at him, and neither of us spoke for a moment. Then he said that we should maintain positions until the interior party returned, and I said nothing. That silence on my part was its own kind of answer, and I think he heard it. The morning of the 19th brought something new. The men on the early watch, rotating at the 4th hour before dawn, found marks at the water's edge, impressions in the wet sand at the tide line, oval depressions of the kind I had described from the interior forest path. But here, in fresh wet sand, where the impression would hold for examination. I measured one of these marks, 3 feet and 4 inches in its long dimension, perhaps 16 inches across its widest point. The distance between adjacent marks, in what appeared to be a walking pattern, was approximately 8 feet between centers. I measured this twice, because the first measurement seemed wrong. 8 feet of stride. I have a stride of approximately 2.5 feet. Whatever had made these prints had a stride of 8 feet and a foot length of over 3 feet. I measured my own foot against the impression, for comparison, and my foot occupied approximately a quarter of the length of the impression. I measured Rodrigo Mena's foot, which is somewhat larger than mine. It occupied approximately the same proportion. 4 of my feet, laid end to end, would equal the length of one of those impressions. I noted this in my log with the dimensions. I said to Tomas Bravo, who was measuring beside me, that these were recent, made within the last few hours, while we had been sitting around the fire listening to the percussion. He said that he knew that. He said that he needed to speak with Captain Salcedo about the pilot's gig. I am going to tell you now about the 19th of October in some detail, because that day was the critical day, the day on which the argument I mentioned reached its conclusion, and I want the record to be precise about what was said and why. The interior survey party had not returned. They had been ordered to return by the previous evening, and they had not. Salcedo was not visibly alarmed by this. He said they might have made camp in the interior rather than attempt the forest in darkness, which was a reasonable decision on their part. He sent a small party to the forest edge to signal with a horn and await a response. There was no response from the interior. Meanwhile, I had taken a careful accounting of the remaining men and their positions and the state of the ships. All 3 caravels were still at anchor in the bay, apparently intact. The ship watches reported nothing unusual during the night, though the men on watch had heard the percussion clearly from the ships and had been understandably disturbed by it. The supply stores were intact. The pilot's gig was ready, as Bravo had ensured. We had, by my count, 37 men on the beach, with 4 unaccounted for in the interior. I went to Captain Salcedo mid-morning, and I laid out what I had. The percussion increasing in proximity and duration, the camp disturbances, the impressions at the tide line, the silhouette at the fire's edge, the interior party's failure to return, the bird's behavior, the ridge percussion marks. I laid it out methodically and without embellishment, and I said that in my professional assessment we had evidence of something on this island that was large enough to be a serious physical threat, organized enough to have coordinated positions around our camp in daylight while remaining unseen, intelligent enough to have moved our supplies without waking us, and patient enough to have maintained a 2-night perimeter of sound without ceasing. I said that in my professional assessment we should begin loading the ships immediately and depart by midday. Salcedo said, "And the 4 men?" I said, "If they are alive, they will hear the ship's horns and come to the shore. If they do not come to the shore within 2 hours of sustained signaling, I am asking you to consider that the decision we are making by waiting is a decision to risk 37 additional lives on the possibility of recovering 4. He said, "They have not been proven dead." I said, "No, they have not. But we have 4 missing men, and we have whatever left those marks at the tide line, and I do not believe it is a coincidence." He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "We wait until tomorrow morning. If they are not back by tomorrow morning, I will hear your recommendation again." He said it as a concession, I think, or perhaps as a delay that he believed would resolve itself by the interior party's return. I said that I accepted this conditional and that I was going to make the ships ready to leave on short notice regardless, and he said that he considered this prudent navigation. I want to record here what the last thing was that Salcedo said to me that afternoon, because it matters to me that it is in the official record. He found me at the water's edge taking additional measurements of the tide line impressions, and he said, quietly, so that no one else could hear, "Echeverria, if what you believe is true, and I am not saying it is, but if it is, then the 4 men in the interior are already beyond our help, and I am keeping us here for my own conscience and not for them. I know that. I am telling you so that you know I know it." He paused, and then he said, "God help me, I still cannot give the order to leave them." I did not know what to say to this. And so I said nothing, and he walked away. I have thought about those words many times since. I believe he was telling me the truth. I believe he was a man who understood the mathematics and could not perform the necessary division. I do not blame him for this. I am not certain, in his position, that I would have been different. The afternoon of the 19th was clear and warm, and the bay was calm, and it was the most peaceful-looking afternoon we had experienced on the island. The men were quiet, but not disorderly. Salcedo had organized them into useful work: repairs to the San Esteban's rigging, collection of additional fresh water, maintenance of the camp. He was keeping them occupied, which was the right choice. Idle men, in a frightening situation, find ways to make the situation worse. Father Alonso walked with the men and spoke to them individually, and I think his presence helped. I took the time that afternoon to write in my private log a full account of everything I had observed and everything I believed. Not the careful diplomatic account I had been giving the official log, but the unfiltered version. I wrote it for this purpose, so that if we did not all make it off this island, and I did not know then that we would not all make it off, whoever found my log would have a true account. I want you to know this record exists and is in this office's custody as of today. As the sun descended toward the horizon, I noticed that the birds had gone entirely silent, not cycling through their intervals as they had the previous day. Silent. Completely silent, from the interior forest, from the beach, from everywhere. There were birds visible, sitting in the trees at the forest edge, but they were not calling. They were sitting in the way birds sit when a predator is very close. I noted the time in my log. I went to find Tomas Bravo, and I found him already looking at the forest edge, with the same expression I had seen on Father Alonso's face on the first evening. I told him that I needed him at the gig, and he came without a word. The percussion began before dark. This is what I said before. The sound began at full dark on the second night. On the third night, the night of the 19th going into the 20th of October, it began before dark, while the last light was still aglow above the western horizon, still enough to see the outline of the bay and the shapes of the ships at anchor. It began, as the previous night had not, with a single voice from the eastern ridge, the first voice, the original voice, and it was followed within moments by the full complement of voices from all directions, and the speed of the completion of the encirclement was much faster than the night before, perhaps 15 seconds from first beat to the full surrounding pattern. They had not been waiting for darkness. They had been waiting for something, and whatever it was had arrived. I am going to tell you now about the night of the 19th and 20th, and I am going to tell it exactly as I experienced it, without the moderating language I have been using, because this is the record that needs to exist. The men on the ships heard the percussion, and the ship watches began calling across the water to the beach camp, wanting instruction. Salcedo gave instruction by signal horn: maintain positions, hold the watch, do not attempt to land. The camp was armed. The fire was maximum. The 37 men were arrayed in a circle around the fire with weapons available. The percussion had been going for perhaps 40 minutes when Rodrigo Mena, standing at the northern perimeter again, said in a completely flat voice that something was in the water. I heard it before I saw anything, a displacement sound, the sound of large bodies moving through chest-deep water, not quietly, but not hurriedly either. The bay was dark beyond the reach of the firelight, but there was enough starlight to see the surface of the water, and the surface of the water between the beach and the ships was moving in a way that water moves when something passes through it. Multiple somethings, moving parallel to one another, spread across the width of the bay. Then the Santa Magdalena moved, not in the way a ship moves on its anchor in a swell. It moved as if pulled. The bow swung to port sharply, the anchor chain snapping taut and then going slack, and then the chain came up through the bow hawse with a sound I have heard only once before, when a chain is freed from its anchor rather than holding it, and the Santa Magdalena drifted free. The men on her deck were shouting. Her watch of 4 men were shouting across the water, and then they were not shouting, and I do not know what happened to them. In my log, I recorded that the watch fell silent. I am recording the same here. I do not know more than that. The San Esteban was next. I did not see what happened to her anchor because I was watching the water between the ships and the beach, and in that water there were shapes, vertical shapes, very large, moving slowly through water that did not come above what would have been, on a man of ordinary height, the mid-chest. The water was, at the position where I estimated the shapes to be standing, approximately 8 to 10 feet deep at low tide, which it was near enough to. They were standing in 10 feet of water. The shapes stood above the waterline, above it substantially. Rodrigo Mena fired his crossbow. He fired it at the nearest shape in the water, a dark mass moving toward the San Esteban, and I heard the impact sound. Or rather, I heard an impact sound, and then the shape did not stop and did not alter its course, and the San Esteban's hull sounded a deep groan, and then a crack, and the ship rolled to starboard in a manner consistent with something applying force to her keel from below, and she continued to roll past the point of recovery, and the men on her deck went into the water with the equipment and rigging. Men were in the water. Some of them swam. I am not going to detail what I observed in the water after that. I am telling you that men went into the water, and some of them reached the beach, and some of them did not. The Nuestra Señora de los Vientos, my ship, was the third. She sat in the innermost position of the anchorage, closest to the beach, and what came for her moved along the bottom of the bay in a way that I could see only as a displacement of water on the surface, a bow wave, running toward her, too fast for what should have been able to move that fast at that depth. She struck the reef at the bay's southern edge. I heard it. She struck it twice. The second strike was harder, and her mainmast came down. At this point, the pilot's gig was the only vessel remaining intact, drawn up on the beach above the tide line. It had 8 oars, and capacity for perhaps 16 men without cargo. I am going to tell you now about the decision, which is the part of this deposition that I believe you are most interested in, and I am going to tell it plainly, without attempting to present myself in a better light than is accurate. 37 men were on the beach. Of those, some number, I do not know exactly how many, had been lost or incapacitated when the San Esteban capsized, and the men went into the water. The shapes in the water were moving toward the beach. The Nuestra Señora de los Vientos was on the reef and sinking. The percussion had not stopped. It had not slowed. It surrounded us as completely in that moment as it had at any point in the 3 nights. But now there were also the shapes in the water, and the sounds from the water, and the Santa Magdalena drifting free, and the camp behind us was behind us only because whatever was in the interior had not yet come down from the forest, which I did not know for certain, and could only hope. Captain Salcedo was standing at the water's edge. He had been there since the Nuestra Señora struck the reef, watching the bay. He was looking for the interior party. I believe he was looking for them. I believe that even in that moment, he was looking toward the forest path and not toward the water, or rather he was looking toward both, trying to find the 4 men before deciding what he would do about the gig. I made the decision. I want this in the record clearly and without ambiguity. I made the decision. Not one of the other men, not Tomas Bravo, who had told me he wanted to leave, not Rodrigo Mena, who was reloading his crossbow with shaking hands, not Father Alonso, who was on his knees behind me. I made it. I told the men who were capable of moving to get the gig into the water. I ordered them in my voice of command, which I have used at sea for 23 years, and they moved because that voice does not invite argument. We got the gig to the water's edge. Salcedo turned around and saw what we were doing. He walked toward me, not running, walking, and his face was what I expected it to be. Not anger, not betrayal, but the expression of a man confirming something he had already known was coming. He said, "Echeverria," not as an accusation, as a question. I said, "There is room. Come now." He looked at the gig, and at the men already in it, and at the water, and at the forest path. He said, "The 4 men." I said, "Captain, come now." He said, "I will not leave them." These are the exact words. I am giving them to you because they are exact. He said, "I will not leave them." And I held his eyes for the length of perhaps 2 seconds, which is the length of a long look between men who have already said everything there is to say. and then I told the men at the oars to row, and I took the gig's stern line, and I pulled us off the beach. Salcedo did not try to stop me. He stood at the waterline and he watched us go. There were other men on the beach who could not reach the gig in time, or who did not move when I gave the order, and they were at the waterline with him. I will give you their names if you require them. I do not have an exact count of who was in the gig and who was not, because I was not counting, I was rowing. I was at the stern oar, and I was rowing with everything I had, and I was not looking back. I looked back once. The beach was perhaps 40 yards behind us, and the fire was still burning, and I could see figures at the waterline, several figures, and I could see the shapes in the water on both sides of the gig's course, and I could not see them clearly enough to describe what I saw, only that they were large and that they were not pursuing the gig. They were not pursuing. The shapes in the water were not coming after us. They were moving, but they were moving back toward the beach and the remaining ships, not outward toward the open water where we were rowing. I noted this. I noted it because it was the thing that allowed us to survive, and because it is strange, and I do not know what to make of it. We rowed. I do not know how many of us were in the gig. I know that Tomas Bravo was at the bow oar, and Father Alonso was behind me, and Rodrigo Mena was somewhere in the middle, and there were other men whose names I knew and will give you if required, and we rowed. The bay opened into the ocean, and the ocean was dark, and the island fell behind us, and as the island fell behind us, the percussion continued. I could hear it clearly for a long time, clearly enough to count the voices, which I did, because counting is what I do when I need to keep my mind occupied and not do other things with it. I counted 14 distinct percussive voices in the pattern when we were perhaps a quarter-mile out. The sound did not diminish as we rowed. It stayed at approximately the same volume for what I estimate was half an hour, which means that whatever was producing the sound was not standing still at the positions I had originally estimated. It was following us along the shore, tracking our course along the coastline, staying parallel to us as we rowed north and west toward open water. When I could no longer see the island in the darkness, the percussion stopped. Not gradually, all at once, complete silence, as if the island had been turned off. The silence was total. The ocean was around us and beneath us, and the stars were above us, and there was no sound except our oars and our breathing. No one spoke for a long time. Father Alonso said, "Eventually, are we clear of it?" I said that, by my reckoning, we were approximately 2 miles from the island. He asked if that was enough. I said I did not know what enough meant in this context, and that I was going to concentrate on navigation. He said nothing else. We rowed through the night, and in the morning I was able to take a sun sight and establish our position, and we were approximately where I expected us to be, which was a relief because I had been navigating in the dark by stars and by instinct, and there had been no guarantee of accuracy. The island was not visible. We had food and water for perhaps 4 days if we were careful, and we were on a reasonable heading for the Canaries, which were our nearest option. We made the Canaries after 8 days, which required rationing, but we made them. It was during the second morning, the morning of the 21st, that Tomas Bravo found the crossbow bolt. He found it floating in the water beside the gig, which was not in itself remarkable because we had brought miscellaneous equipment into the gig during the scramble of the departure, and things had been lost overboard. He reached over and picked it up, which was a natural thing to do, and then he held it up and looked at it, and showed it to me without speaking. "I have placed that bolt before you on this table. You have examined it. You have seen the angle of the deflection at the midsection, which is as I described, bent back on itself, not broken, not cracked, bent." Rodrigo Mena identified it as his. The fletching pattern was one he had made himself, and he knew his own work. He said he had fired it the previous night into the water at the nearest shape. He said he had not recovered it after firing. No one had. The bolt had been in the water. It had been returned to the gig. I want to be careful here about the sequence. Rodrigo Mena fired the bolt. The shape did not stop. The Nuestra Senora struck the reef. We rode away from the island in the pilot's gig. The island disappeared in the dark. The percussion stopped, and in the morning, floating beside the gig in 2 miles of open ocean, was the bolt Rodrigo Mena had fired into the shape in the water, bent back on itself at the midsection, recovered without explanation. I am not proposing an explanation. I am stating what was observed. I am a navigator. I record observations. The bolt was fired. The bolt was recovered. The condition of the bolt at recovery was as you see it. These are the facts. Anything beyond the facts is speculation, and I have been asked to give a deposition, not a speculation. What I am prepared to say, in addition to the facts, is this. The bolt was not bent by the impact of striking stone. I have seen bolts recovered after impact with stone walls, with ship timber, with metal plate, and I have examined each type of damage carefully, because understanding the behavior of materials is part of my professional practice. Stone impact shatters or chips wood and bends iron tips, but it does not bend the shaft midway along its length with the smooth radius of curvature that this bolt exhibits. The curvature is the curvature of something bending a green branch with its hands, a deliberate flex applied along the length with controlled pressure. I cannot account for this. I am reporting it. The bolt is your physical evidence, and you may have it examined by any craftsman or armorer you choose. I want to address, briefly and in conclusion, several things that I anticipate this inquiry will ask me about. The 4 men in the interior, and Captain Salcedo, and the men who did not reach the gig, I do not know what became of them. I have no information about their condition after the gig left the beach. I made a decision to preserve the men in the gig, and I believe it was the correct decision, given what I had observed. And I also understand that it was a decision that had consequences for men who were not in the gig, and I will carry that understanding for whatever time remains to me. I am not asking for absolution. I am stating the facts as I know them. Captain Salcedo chose to remain. That was his decision, made in full knowledge of what I was doing, and I respected him for it then, and I respect him for it now, and I wish, with a part of my mind that has no business in a formal deposition, that the mathematics had come out differently. The island's position, I have given you the coordinates as best as I can establish them from my log and my celestial observations during the survey period. They are as accurate as I can make them. I do not know if the island was on any prior chart. I do not know if Silvera's account described the same island or a different one. I believe it was the same island. I believe Silvera survived his encounter there only because he did not enter the interior, did not take more than water and a brief anchorage, and departed before the 3rd night. I believe the threshold is the interior. We crossed into the forest, and we took water in quantity, and we stayed past the 2nd night, and the response was what I have described. This is inference, not observation. I mark it as inference. What I will say, and this is the last thing I intend to say in this deposition, is addressed to this body directly, and I ask that it be recorded in full. Do not send another fleet to this island. I understand that the Crown's interest in mid-Atlantic way stations is genuine, and that the route Silvera described is strategically valuable. I understand that the loss of 3 ships, and the majority of 41 men will produce, in some quarters, a desire for a larger and better armed expedition to recover what was lost and to establish what is there. I understand this reasoning. It is a reasoning I would have shared before the 14th of October. Do not send another fleet. The island already knows how to receive ships. Whatever is on that island has had long practice. The percussion marks on the ridge rock were worn deep enough to suggest centuries of use. The fire rings were not the work of a season. Whatever has been doing this has been doing it long enough that the method is perfected. Another fleet will not learn more than we learned. It will learn it faster, perhaps, and perhaps in the 1st night rather than the 3rd, and there will be no pilot's gig and no deposition for the record. There will be nothing. The bolt on this table is the only evidence I have. It is evidence enough. I recovered it from the water on the morning of the 21st of October, 1525. I have transported it to Seville in the condition you see, because this office asked for physical evidence, and this is what I have. I am asking you now, formally, in this deposition which is the property of the Crown, to record my recommendation. Do not send another fleet. The cost of confirming what I have told you today will be every life on every ship you send. I have nothing further to add. I am at this office's disposal for any clarifying questions you have, and I will answer them in the same manner in which I have answered all of the foregoing, as accurately as I am able, as completely as the record requires, and without invention. This deposition is concluded. I ask that the crossbow bolt be retained by this office as submitted physical evidence, and that a copy of this record be held in the Maritime Archive. My name is Iker Echeverria, pilot, licensed navigator of the Casa de Contratación. I have sworn to the truth of the foregoing account, and I stand by it.